As early as I can remember, I was overwhelmed, over-planning, overthinking, everything. For a long time, I had no idea that everyone around me wasn't experiencing the exact same thing. I figured that was just life. It wasn't until adulthood that I was finally diagnosed as being on the autism spectrum. Of course, my experience is different than many, and my rather mild autism symptoms have allowed me to avoid a lot of the stigma and pain that a lot of folks on the spectrum deal with on a daily basis. So before you dive in, you should know that this is neither medical advice nor claims of a one-size-fits-all experience related to addiction or autism. This is just my story, so take what helps and leave the rest. As always, this show is about getting conversations started, and I think there's a really important conversation here. Enjoy the show. Hello, welcome. I'm Ben Boyce, and this is the Dr. Junkie Show. In today's episode is yet another response to emails and questions that I've received over the years, this time about autism and addiction. As many of you know, if you've listened to the show for a while, I'm on the spectrum, Asperger's, which nowadays is just grouped in with level 1 autism. That condition has played a huge part in how my addictions played out in life, why I wound up in prison and addicted to mainlining cocaine and heroin. So let's start with autism, because there's a lot of misconceptions about what the spectrum even is, and what it means to be on it. Most people who don't have personal connections to someone on the spectrum often think that the spectrum means we're underwired, that certain portions of our brains don't connect or fire up when neurotypical people's brains do. It's most visible in social situations, because that's when people interact. And it's misunderstood as those of us on the spectrum not being able to make the connections between, say, your facial expressions changing and your mood changing. But that's not quite right. In fact, it's almost entirely backward. Social miscues don't show up anywhere near as often with incoming data as they do with outgoing data. Humans generally conceal their feelings and thoughts, which means those facial expressions and changes of tone of voice, which we're all supposed to pick up on during conversation, they're a drop in the bucket to what we should be doing inside our own bodies during a normal conversation, and what we usually don't let those around us know that we're doing. Social interactions are about masking some of our true feelings while letting others show. They're about ignoring urges to say some things while following urges to say others. In a 5-minute conversation, 100 thoughts might pop into your head, but you throw out 98 of them. And we throw those specific thoughts out because they're statements that we think won't land right, or they're offensive comments that will provoke the other person's anger, or they're facial expressions that will make someone feel on edge. We strip those things out, and instead, during normal conversation, we only use safe comments and facial expressions, at least for most of our interactions. It's really hard to not say something that annoys someone if you don't know which of the 10 statements that pops into your head is going to be read as annoying or offensive. And that's how autism plays out in real time, at least in my life. And it's also why many of us learn at a young age to just stuff it. We learn to just shut the fuck up to avoid the discipline that's certain to define our lives if we say the things that pop into our heads in front of the wrong person. Autism is an overwiring of the brain, not an underwiring. We don't have too few connections, we have too many, or rather, too many at one time. That's autism. Once those of us who are on the spectrum start to understand that, we often find cool ways to put that overwiring to use. Things like making podcasts or writing books or earning college degrees. In social situations, which are indeed where these differences cause the biggest issues in our lives, we often do miss small cues that would guide others or expectations communicated without language, those facial expressions. But it's not so much because we don't notice them, It's more because we notice everything along with them. It's all the same volume. Communication is a process of selective attention. And we get so good at it as humans that we sort of forget we're doing it by the time we're grown. But a lot of it is lying, misleading, and manipulation. Your friend might ask you how they look, and even if they look bad, you probably have some motives that will cause you to say anything except you look awful. If, say, they're dressed up for an evening on the town, you might say, that looks good, but you'd look better in blue. Manipulation versus lying. If they're crying after a breakup alone in their home, you might say, you look fine, and besides, you're at home. Misleading using situational awareness. They're still lies, manipulative lies to boot, but they're designed to make your friend feel better because you want them to feel better. So we just get used to behaving that way, to communicating that way. Eventually, it just feels normal, and we don't even notice it when we do it. Other times, it's that thing that pops into your head that you do notice, and sometimes you almost say it out loud, even if you're not on the spectrum. But luckily, you check it and rephrase it, or you throw it out altogether before it slips out of your mouth most times. Those failures to speak up, they're also strategic lies. We avoid the answers that pop into our heads in favor of another one that's nicer, or that's easier for the other person to hear. And all of this requires a close, nonstop following of intricate social cues in real time. You have to hear those changes in tone of voice, or see lips or eyebrows raise half an inch. And you have to make sense of those ambiguous things and respond the way that you're expected to respond. If it's a friend, we respond differently than if it's a stranger. If it's our family member, we offer yet another response to the same situation. It's all manipulations meant to cause people to feel or to do what we want them to feel or do, even though what we want them to do often benefits them as well. So we don't really feel selfish when we tell these lies. So yes, when it comes to autism, it is social clues that we frequently miss. But it's not that we miss a smile or that we can't understand anger. It's that we overread everything all the time. And to make sense of it, we have to sort of turn it all down because it's all always visible. It's always in our line of sight. That means when so-called normal people, neurotypical people, when they hear something and automatically formulate a response based on all sorts of contextual clues, which they seldom even think about consciously, they're basically turning off parts of their conscious experience of the world and responding to questions or comments based on an updated version of expectations. And again, it just feels normal when we do it. It's not even conscious most of the time. With those of us on the spectrum, we don't turn off those things, certainly not automatically. That's why we're often read as being ornery or petty when we do eventually get shit-talked and we just disengage. We can turn down all of our responses and just shut the fuck up. But we can't change the way we experience life or the way that we view the world. We can lie about it, but we can't alter our truth. And herein lies the problem. When the social contract causes everyone else to abide by a set of rules wherein they strategically lie and spin in real time based on the expectations of those around them, we can't play along. And our failures are read as mean, ignorant, inappropriate, or sometimes even vulgar. We make connections that other people don't make, because when those automatically turned off portions of your brain remain active in our brains, we have an entirely different thinking process. We often come to different conclusions because we see the world differently. That inability to turn off portions of conscious thought, it's not just with people who we're talking to. It's everything in our world. In cars, for example, when something is rattling, my partner has the ability to tune it out, to just keep driving and not care, to basically click, turn off that portion of her conscious experience of the world in favor of paying attention to other things going on instead. And so long as no one consistently points it out to her, she can usually just keep it tuned out. That's often not possible if you're on the spectrum. and I often have to pull over and fix the noise. I have to make it stop. And of course, that too is often read as petty and irritable. But it's just a matter of wanting to free up some broadband width, to remove one small piece of data that's streaming into my conscious experience of the world so that others can receive more of my limited attention. For me, that's autism. It can turn into a constant battle with oneself to be oneself. Because once the world beats us down a few times for saying things or doing things that we didn't realize were going to annoy or offend someone, we often stop engaging. We stop trusting in our own judgment, and we just shut down. Okay, so before I go any further, if you're thinking that my symptoms also sound a lot like ADHD, OCD, or at times even depression, that makes perfect sense. I actually was diagnosed with some of those things before I was an adult. And that's not unusual. A lot of people on the spectrum are misdiagnosed or co-diagnosed with conditions like the ones I listed because the symptoms largely overlap. The DSM-5 estimates that around 70% of us with autism spectrum disorder have one other mental disorder, and that 40% of us have 2 or more additional mental disorders. And those other disorders often get noticed or labeled before the autism is obvious. It turns out autism is actually a lot more common than we used to think. The CDC currently estimates that 1 in 68 kids have it. And that number might be low, since symptoms don't always show up until social development, which happens in stages. That's why autism is known as a developmental disorder. As we develop, we encounter situations that most humans deal with in a certain way. All that lying, manipulating stuff I said before. When we get there and we don't understand those same social clues, of course it produces anxiety, and we sometimes get diagnosed with that. Or it produces depression, and that label sticks. But the behavior requires some pretty specific things to be listed as autism spectrum. For example, people on the spectrum experience hyperdedication to certain activities, especially for kids. For me, it was memorization. I once wrote down the entire script of The Princess Bride from memory. There's that overthinking I was talking about. Another quick example from my life, I used to split things into patterned doses, from food to staircases to steps between here and the place I was going. 3, 2, and 1 was my go-to pattern. I would always try to ascend the stairs or eat all the broccoli pieces on my plate or whatever else I was doing in a pattern where I could take 3 at a time twice, 2 at a time twice, then a single one twice. 3, 2, 1. Where you might think to yourself, I wonder how many stairs there are and if I could break them up into equal parts of 3, 2, and 1 steps. If you're neurotypical, you'd probably discard that thought as soon as it showed up. You might not even notice it. But there's that overwiring again. Autism doesn't allow that to happen. And often those little thoughts have just as much volume as all of our other thoughts. Walk up the stairs in this patterned count is just as important as let the dog in or be sure to cook dinner tonight. So we just do it, or we just say it, or we just write it. That's autism. Mine also manifested as a kid as what many people at the time called floppiness or bad behavior. I would disrupt class with comments, things that weren't original or clever in any way, things that everybody probably thought at one point, but things that they could just set aside as unimportant. I, on the other hand, would blurt it out. Math problems where Susie has 2 marbles and Jim has 3, how many do they have altogether? They'd beg questions like, where are they? How do they know each other? Are they playing marbles right now? And often, teachers read my disruptions as deliberate, so I was punished instead of treated. By high school, I'd learned that rapid-talking kid, he wasn't doing himself any favors. So I shut the fuck up and turned a lot of that confusion inward, spending many years depressed and lonely and a little bit confused. And damn if that doesn't take a psychological toll, especially during adolescence. So what's any of this have to do with drugs and addiction? I probably just gave it away. I wasn't diagnosed with autism until well into my adulthood, and even then I wasn't sure what to do with the diagnosis because it didn't come with a lot of explanation, but it did come with a ton of cultural baggage. But as I've gone through life and continued to learn about autism, I found more and more ways to take control of some of the things that before had felt uncomfortable or inexplicable, things that even got me in trouble at times. Once I figured out how to direct the flow of thoughts, I could put that river to use. Before I understood my diagnosis, I was just a bad guy who was so selfish that I stole things from people to pay for dope. After the diagnosis and the education that followed, I came to understand that I was just a human being on the spectrum who did what anyone in my position would have done had they been in the same body and in the same situation. I made sense of my world. As your therapist will tell you the same way mine did, understanding the reasons why you do something or why you did something, that's half the therapeutic process when you feel bad about something in your past. The other half is figuring out how to redirect those energies which have become toxic in some way. So of course, I still had this drug addiction I had to deal with. And I was really annoyed at the idea of never using drugs again, or of being forced to ultimately embrace the religious tenets of 12-step programs. I had to get to the bottom of why being on the spectrum would result in my becoming an addicted person. And maybe, if I was lucky, I might even find a way to explain why I still felt the desire to use drugs. And at that point, it wasn't hard to draw those last lines between a childhood where I learned to repress everything for fear of social discipline, and a life where I was dumping narcotics into my body non-stop to balm the bubbling fury that sort of repression causes. I got so deep into drugs because they not only treated some of my autism symptoms, very well in fact, but more importantly, they treated the trauma of having learned to shut the fuck up at a young age. And that's what really got me in trouble. With autism, everything is always on. And yes, it is mostly a social issue. But think about what that really means. Violence, for example. It's a part of our world, and fuck if humans don't typically love it, at least in their favorite form. Whether it's UFC bloodlust or boxing, wrestling, or even street fights, we're a species who seems determined to destroy those around us and to take joy in watching others do the same. But we're also an incredibly loving and empathetic species. We feel things for others, often people we don't even know. Both of these traits were vital to our evolutionary survival. Violence requires one to shut down the portion of their brain that sees the other person as a full human worthy of all the protections we should offer all people. To enjoy somebody being beaten or hurt, you have to instead see them as something you want destroyed, scarred. It's a pretty fucked up place to work oneself mentally, but most of us seem more than willing to do it on a regular basis, if only by vicariously watching it on TV or at an event. I hate violence, and that's because it fucks me up, sometimes for weeks when I witness something violent. I get paranoid and anxious every time I leave the house, not for my own physical safety necessarily, but for my emotional well-being. I don't want to be exposed to it again. It's debilitating. And until I understood the gift that autism had actually given me on this one, I thought I was a freak. It seemed like everyone else, especially men, were down to fantasize about kicking people's asses or fucking people up. But my difference is, again, rooted in my autism. I just can't turn those things off. And it affects me in a lot of ways. It's also my personal life. I understand we're all supposed to lie to each other and treat our friends better than everyone else, which means we lie to them more than everyone else. It's weird when you say it out loud. So I have all these friends who love my honesty. They tell me all the time, it's so cool that you said that to that person, until I'm honest with them. I think what anyone would think when they see something, but instead of deactivating the thoughts that I shouldn't share with friends, I often just dive in and say what I mean. I'm that guy who you can always call if you want somebody to tell you the truth about what they're thinking. Between the difficulties in keeping friends and the overwhelming sense that often comes with just being in my skin, it's not hard to spot why I turned to drugs. And I found in them exactly what most users find in them: relief. I've shared before that when I started using drugs, I remember being a bit resentful at the realization that I suddenly felt the same way as it appeared much of the world gets to feel every day, without drugs. Sure, I got really high, but near the end of the days where I was using cocaine and heroin the heaviest, my use was mostly about relieving my anxiety, clearing my head, calming down that noise. The drugs fixed a lot of that, at least temporarily, but I didn't have a lot of the tools that I would have needed to survive that situation. Things like drug education, a mature support group who wouldn't judge me for using, connections to lifelong friends who know me, identity-creating employment. I didn't have any of it. So that inability to shut things off, it also plays a big role in continued use. And again, it comes down to an inability to turn off certain portions of our brain, an overwiring. Once dependent on a drug, if I decided to stop taking it, like I did with heroin at various times in my life, I wouldn't be able to stop thinking about the relief offered if I would just go use. If you have a sore knee or a swollen wrist, you can probably notice the pain, but effectively shut down the part of your thoughts responsible for reminding you all day that it hurts. You get to a point where you hardly even notice it until you move it or bump it against something. But when you can't turn those thoughts off, that discomfort becomes everything. You know you could fix it with just a single dose, and you know exactly where to go to get that dose. Not being able to stop thinking about it is the reason that so many users struggle with relapse and long-term use. Being on the spectrum only made it worse. The last thing I want to talk about today is marijuana and autism, because that was the first drug I really got into deep. I used to smoke 6-7 blunts a day, sometimes more. But of course, using marijuana back in the 90s, it also made me an outlaw. You can't be an outlaw and a good guy, at least not at the same time. So I became an outlaw. I actually tattooed it across my belly. I couldn't be a good guy if every cop who saw me would arrest me, so I became the counterpart of those cops that wanted to ruin my life. The bad guy drug user dealer who just doesn't give a fuck about anyone or himself. And it all just seemed like a logical reaction to my first arrest for marijuana when I was 15, an event that came with the walk of shame through my entire high school and a 2-week suspension on top of my criminal charges. Now, of course, back then, I didn't have the evidence that we currently have, that people who are on the spectrum and use cannabis to treat their symptoms of anxiety or depression or of feeling overwhelmed find great relief in the products we use within just 30 days. We weren't allowed to do studies like that back then. The reason we need a legal, regulated supply in the United States isn't to increase the use of drugs. Legal supply actually doesn't do that. When people have access to safe, affordable, cheap, and accessible chemicals of varying sizes and potencies, they actually tend to use more responsibly, to use less potent drugs, and to overdose far less often. When you surround drug users with family members, therapists, doctors, friends, jobs, and education, we take advantage of those human vices, and we usually control or even reduce or halt our own drug use without ever being forced to do so. U.S. citizens spend $100 billion every year on illegal and untaxed narcotics. And most of our street drugs are cut with poisons, spiced up with other drugs, or passed off as something that they are entirely not. That's a lot of tax revenue to play with once we start selling those same products in reputable businesses with well-trained medical and mental health specialists. People like me, who are on the spectrum, struggling with life, and find ourselves drawn into a world of addiction, we won't exist anymore as soon as we have doctors around us. We won't be interacting with drug dealers on the street who are handing us new and more potent drugs, raising our tolerance. I realize that autism, just like any condition, is different for everyone. But hopefully this episode helped you understand a little bit more about how addiction and autism work together, and how legalizing and regulating all drugs helps yet another group of people who are otherwise likely to wind up addicted and in trouble. Love yourselves and the addicted people in your life. I'm Ben Boyce. If you're still here, you might want more. So consider checking out my book, Dr. Junkie, One Man's Story of Addiction and Crime that will challenge everything you know about the war on drugs. You can get it wherever you buy books. If you want to know what the world would look like if drugs were legal, or why we develop tolerance and sensitization to drugs when we take them for extended periods, or if you just want to know why I went to prison, check out the book.